The game is over. The Rebels have won.
In the Battle To Save Celtic series, we've spoken extensively with supporters groups, financial analysts, former board members, Celtic fanzines and journalists, as we look to cover the story from all angles. But what we've yet to cover in any great detail is how the new Celtic was shaping up after Fergus McCann came into power in March 1994. When Tommy Burns left the club towards the end of the 96-97 season, it became clear that McCann wanted to introduce a new structure to the football department, and with that came the newly created role of general manager. And today I'm delighted to be joined by that very man as Jock Brown tells us of 510 fascinating days in paradise as part of the Fergus McCann regime. Jock, welcome to the Celtic Exchange. We're nearly 30 years on from those eventful times. How do you generally reflect on that time in your life?
I reflect generally warmly on it. I enjoyed it very much, and it was a fascinating period,
Yeah. Before you took on your role at Celtic, you were already fairly well known to folk in Scottish football, having had a successful career both in law, particularly sports law, I believe, whilst also being a prominent broadcaster and commentator on the Scottish game. I'd say it's fairly unique to juggle both of those roles at the same time. So could you tell us a wee bit about that part of your career and how the commentary came about?
Well, the commentary came about by a bit of an accident, really, because I was attending a match, I remember, at Fir Park, Motherwell, St Mirren, a cup tie. Alec Ferguson managing St Mirren at the time. And I bumped into Archie McPherson, whom I knew. I'd known since a boy, actually. And he told me that BBC were expanding the radio coverage from the following season. Do you fancy being involved? And I thought, sounds quite a good idea, aye. So I thought, yeah, I'll do that. That was February, I think. I heard not a thing until 8th of August that year, and then I got a phone call that day on a Friday saying, I understand you're up for doing some football. Could you go to a game tomorrow at Rugby Park, Kilmarnock? Mm-hmm. And I went there as a radio broadcaster, and that's where it started.
What would be the highlight of your commentary career? Would it be, is there cup finals, incidents, special moments, anything that jumps out through the various years on the mic?
I think the highlights would all relate to, well, it would relate mostly to the Scotland team, because we tended to qualify in those days for finals. So I enjoyed all of these games, the qualifying games in particular. Actually getting the finals was a bit of a disappointment, as it turned out, but the qualifying was terrific. But the other one, the one that sticks out apart from that, is Aberdeen Real Madrid in 1983 at the Cup Winners' Cup final.
Wow, yeah.
Which was an incredible match and performance.
Just in terms of the Scotland stuff, obviously, your brother, as and was Craig Brown, famous figure in Scottish football, and most known for being the Scotland manager. Did you ever have a situation or a time where you had to be critical of the team when Craig was in charge? Would that have caused any conflict?
It did have that issue, yeah, no question about that. The most important one was, the most significant one was in Monaco, when Estonia played Scotland for the game, after the game that didn't take place, remember, in Estonia?
Yeah.
And it was to be replayed in Monaco. And we played them in Monaco and drew 0-0. And I had to interview him after the match. So it was quite heavy duty. Yeah. And to the point where I remember, I went into his ribs basically, because I knew the world would watch to see how I treated him. So I was really heavier than I would have been with anybody else. And then I went to the airport, and I got him at the airport. I said, look, you understand what I had to do in that interview. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, I had to get in your ribs. Oh, did you? It doesn't matter. It's no problem.
I was about to ask, were you able to keep the professional stuff professional and the personal stuff personal? That's a good way to be. Aside from the broadcasting, Jock, you studied at Cambridge University before going on to become a lawyer. And I believe you played a bit of football there, including a few appearances at Wembley.
Yeah, I played in the varsity match at Wembley 3 times, Cambridge beat Oxford 3 times. I was fortunate enough to be in the team each time. Yeah.
Did you ever envisage a career as a player in the game?
Not by that time. By that time I knew I hadn't. Earlier on I did. I harboured great hopes of being a player, but just simply wasn't good enough.
Okay, but playing at Wembley, not everyone can say that, so great achievement in itself. So when Celtic start looking for the general manager, this newly created position in 1997, preferably someone with a background in law, As someone with exactly that, a background in law as well as extensive knowledge of the Scottish game, you must have been regarded as a fairly ideal candidate for the role. But I believe that you never actually applied for the role. You were headhunted. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I was headhunted in the sense that a good pal of mine, who's a big Celtic man, phoned me one day and said, have you read the ad for the general manager's job at Celtic? And I said, no, I haven't seen it, no. He said, I'm going to send it to you. I want you to tell me who you think could do it. So he sent me the ad, and he phoned me back very quickly after that. He said, well, who do you think? Who do you think could do that? And I said, I can't think of anybody could do that. No, I don't see it at all. He said, I know somebody who could do it. And I said, oh, really? Who's that? He says, you. And I said, don't be silly. And he phoned me 4 days in a row. And each day I told him to bugger off, basically. Mm-hmm. And then on the 4th day, I was so fed. I was like, what do you want to do about it anyway? He says, I'm going to contact Fergus McCann. I said, well, carry on if you like. And that's what he did.
Why the initial reluctance? It was obviously a high-profile job. Was there any great reason why you weren't so keen to get involved at the start?
It never entered my head. I mean, I was quite happy what I was doing, and I had no idea really the full details of that. I read that ad very quickly and scanned over it, and thought, that's a terrible job. That's so much involved in that, because it's a very, very substantial job description.
Yeah.
So that's a hell of a job. But I remember writing a column though at the time. After reading that, I wrote a column in which I said that I thought the ideal man for the job was Billy McNeill.
And there's been a few folk just as part of this series, Jock, that have mentioned that Billy absolutely should have been back at the club in some capacity, after leaving as manager. When was that? 91, before Liam Brady came in. And I'm still amazed that for whatever reason nobody decided to take him on. That maybe remains a bit of a mystery. In terms of the job itself and the job spec, you've mentioned it, and it's in your book, which is right in front of me here. The job spec was really quite extensive, so many facets to the role, to the point where you sympathised with Tommy Burns, the previous club manager, and various managers before him, in terms of there was just too much work to do for one regular guy. There was so much to the role at Celtic, and this is why Fergus McCann created this, I think what he viewed as a more modern European structure, with a general manager, a head coach, and also a head of youth/development. You described it in the book as a very exciting phase of your life that you entered with your eyes open. But even at that, Jock, were you prepared for what followed in the 510 days after that? Not
fully, in the sense that I knew it was, that I objected to a couple of parts of the job description, and I had an argument with Fergus about it at the time, namely the one where I had to do all the PR and do all the press stuff, with the head coach doing pre- and post-match interviews only, and I had to do everything else. And I said to him, that guarantees this job can't last more than 2 years. Mm-hmm. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, look, there's no way in the world they're going to accept someone who's not picking the team making all these announcements at press conferences and stuff like that. They'll not accept that, and they'll do me in. They'll just do me in. Wouldn't have it. No, it won't be like that at all. It won't be like that. No, I don't want a football person talking about other stuff. He said, I just want him to talk about the games they're going to play in and the games that have just taken place. That's all I want them to do. Apart from that, I want somebody else doing all the talking. I said, well, that's a recipe for disaster as far as I'm concerned. And I thought, I'll still go in and take the job, and I'll persuade him as soon as I can to change that. And I should have known better.
Yeah, by all accounts, a hard man to persuade. You've mentioned that the interview process generally took, I think, a few weeks and several meetings within that. And I'd like to ask at this point, and we'll get into it in more detail, but what were your very first impressions of Fergus? Had you met him before that through your professional work?
No, I'd met him once. I'd met him once because I was involved in the video that was done for Tommy Burns called Return to Paradise, 1994, make it back to Celtic as manager. Mm-hmm. And I was involved with a production company at that time who got the rights to do this video, Return to Paradise, with Tommy Burns stuff. So I had spent a lot of time with Tommy, incidentally, and in the course of doing that, obviously I had to interview Fergus, and I did interview Fergus, who was very polite and courteous about Tommy. He spoke well of him, as he should do. And that was only experience with him. I found him quite cold and offhand and not very enthusiastic about being there, but he did it, and he spoke very well of him.
And was your impression similar when you met him in a professional capacity as you were going for the role? Was he warm, standoffish? How was he?
Very matter of fact.
Okay.
Very matter of fact. There was no warmth wasn't really the word he would have said for that. But mind you, I was into his ribs a bit. I mean, I was challenging him about how it was to work and how he saw it and all that stuff, because I had no axe to grind. I mean, if it all broke down, it made no difference to me at the time. So I was quite strong in saying what I wanted to say to him. I did say to him, look, if you want some yes man to your front your stuff, I'm not your man, don't ask for that.
Yeah, that's also come up because when Fergus took over, so March 1994, and that's the date that this series is focused around, the suggestion is very early on in his tenure at Celtic, he created a board around him who were very much not yes men. He didn't want nodding dogs and people agreeing with everything he said. He wanted to be challenged, brought in guys like Brian Quinn, various others that would push him on his decisions, and I think that's the right way to operate first and foremost, and I think he very much encouraged that. Almost immediately, Jock, and in fact before you took the job, there was resistance by the media and by figures amongst the Celtic support from the likes of the Supporters Association. As part of my research, there's a really poor article by the Daily Record written, I think it was the day of or the day before you were confirmed in the role, which in hindsight I think hinted at the challenges you were going to face throughout your time in the role. Can you tell us a bit more about why you think you faced that early hostility?
I think the usual thing is if they don't know you're coming, you get hostility. And we learned that lesson much later when Jansen and Joseph Englos arrived. If you don't let people know in advance what's anticipated, you'll take stick for whatever decision you make. The other aspect of it was that when I was appointed, the page you're talking about was, I think, maybe even the front page, it might have been in the Daily Record, was saying Jock Brown, quoting the Supporters Association president as saying something it can't possibly because he's a Rangers man. And that was the overriding consideration. The suggestion was because I wasn't, I feel like that's why the book's called Celtic Minded, because I wasn't Celtic minded in the past, I must be a Rangers supporter, which I've never been in my life.
I've got that quote. I think it's a really poor quote. It's from the Celtic Supporters Association. Again, it's before you've been announced. I'll just read it out just now. It says, there are two major problems here. One is that Jock Brown has no experience of running a football club. The second, and it's the one thing that's been annoying most people, is that he's seen as a Rangers man. We all think he is Rangers minded, and that's getting up the noses of our members. But he'll be amongst friends because there seems to be plenty of Rangers minded people in positions of power at Celtic these days. I'm not sure who they're referring to. No. And he says the association is deeply unhappy at the appointment, and some of our members have said that they will hand back season tickets. This is before you've set foot in the office on day one, Jock. How do you feel when you read these quotes? Are you instantly regretting your decision, or is this just par for the course in this world?
No, I kind of anticipated that would be the case because my brother played for Rangers after all, so he started his career there. The fact that he's never been a Rangers supporter either would be unknown to most people. But the fact that I hadn't been a Celtic supporter, obviously, that I wasn't a Roman Catholic, that made me have to be a Rangers man in the eyes of Celtic supporters, which is absolute nonsense. I mean, I'm the happiest man in the country this week because Hamilton Accies get promoted.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, but we'll get to stuff on Accies and the likes later on. My main question, I suppose, in the back of that quote, and I do think it's a really poor quote and it's not aged well at all. I don't think it reflects well on the individuals quoted, but surely the key question above all for such a role as general manager is your ability to do the role. And as we've discussed there, based on your time in the world of law and as a broadcaster in Scotland, surely you were very well qualified to do so.
I think I probably was, yes. And it was interesting that Billy McNeill backed that up completely. He I knew very well, obviously, but he was very complimentary about the decision to take me in there. And that, you'd have thought, would have carried quite a lot of weight among Celtic supporters. Yep. But it's just this terrible Glasgow thing, or West of Scotland thing about you've got to be a Celtic or a Rangers supporter. And you don't. And that's absolutely clear that you just do not need to be that. And I certainly was never either of them before I went to Celtic. And I remember at the press conference when I was first announced, saying, you're not a Celtic supporter. I said, I haven't been a Celtic supporter until this morning. As of this morning, I'm the biggest supporter the club has got. And that was true.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely fair. There's also just a final point on that. As part of the recruitment process, those few weeks spent with Fergus, you asked him the very question whether he had any concerns at appointing, quote unquote, a West of Scotland Protestant. Can you tell us his response to that? I believe it was quite encouraging.
Oh, he said, I couldn't be less interested. That was as simple as that. I didn't know whether you were or you weren't. I don't care. Not interested.
Yeah, and it's good to hear, and it's the right answer. Your first priority, you're just in the door. You've got to appoint a new head coach. No pressure there, of course. Within that structure, as I mentioned, you're general manager. You need to find the guy that will sit beneath you as part of that. And you appoint Wim Jansen, I think about 2 weeks after you started. Fergus was particularly keen, I believe, that a foreign coach was appointed as part of the structure. Wim ticks a lot of boxes, or ticked a lot of boxes at that time. A distinguished playing career, 15 years at Feyenoord, a couple of years at Ajax. He won 65 caps for the Netherlands, played in 2 World Cup finals, 1974, 1978. He'd managed in Belgium at Lokeren, then Feyenoord in the early 90s, and also had a spell with, I think the team is Sanfrecce Hiroshima in Japan. But the initial response from both fans and the media was underwhelming, to say the least. So tell us about that time.
Well, what you're saying is absolutely right. In fact, he was held to be the second worst thing that ever hit Hiroshima when he was appointed, which was just outrageous. In terms of the appointment process, one of the challenges I had and arguments I had with Fergus at the start was he said, he asked me who I thought had any thoughts of who the head coach might be. And I gave him, I think, 3 names. And they're all British. And he said, no, I'm not the only British. Nobody British is getting the job. That's out of the question. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, no. He said, I need someone used to the structure, the head coach and the different structure. And I don't want someone with all the old-fashioned ideas. And I said, but one of the first name I gave you is a guy who has coached all over Europe. He coached internationally. He's hardly been in Britain in his whole career. But he's English. I said, no, he's English. It was Roy Hodgson, by the way.
I was about to say, it sounds like Roy Hodgson. Yeah,
it was
spent
Roy
time
Hodgson.
in Sweden and Italy.
Yeah, who I knew quite well, and I dealt with it, and I have very high regard for him. And he's not out of the question. He's English. That was a major handicap, because you then now into a pool of possibilities, which is vast, but it's one which is not very familiar to people in this country. Mm-hmm. So you've got a problem. And when Wim Jansen came in, he did appear to be very well qualified. But one of the big mistakes we made, though, without question, and I was party to it, was we made certain nobody knew who it would be until the press conference. Now, that's a mistake, and we had to learn from that. And we didn't learn from it when we did it with Joseph Englos either, because we're actually people were coming to the press conference not knowing who was coming in the door, which the club thought was great. The PLC board was overjoyed about that, because we'd stopped all these leaks that were always labelled against Celtic. Mm-hmm. Everything was leaked in the papers before the board knew sometimes. Yeah. And that was stopped, but that was a mistake.
I was going to ask you specifically about that, because I know first and foremost a huge part of your remit was to plug the leaks. You know, Celtic had become known for, or somebody within the building releasing information ahead of its time. But the other side of that is you've got an expectant media kept in the dark, made to look foolish to an extent. And then when you walk out into the press conference with Wim Jansen, they'd be ferociously scribbling and looking at each other saying, who have we got here? Despite the fact that I've mentioned Wim's played in 2 World Cup finals and managed at a pretty decent level. But do you think, in hindsight, and I'm sure you do, having not leaked that information or spoken to a couple of journals in advance, that came back to bite you?
No question. That was a huge mistake. No doubt about that. And it made it absolutely clear-cut a year later, because if you remember, there was a mention that Gerard Houllier was coming the following year. Mm-hmm. And the truth of the matter is that I did approach Gerard Houllier, and in the first conversation I had with him, I'd met him before I knew him, so I made contact with him to establish whether there was a possibility of talking to him about it. And he said, I can tell you now, I'm going to Liverpool. And I said, all right, okay. He said, but I'm happy to meet you. And I actually met him. I had lunch with him in Paris. Mm-hmm. And I was at his house in Paris. And he showed me his Liverpool contract. And I thought, well, I had nothing else to say to you when I saw the numbers of his Liverpool contract. But he said, but I'd love to help, I want to help as much as you can.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he was the first guy to say Joseph Englos.
Okay.
Was Gerard Houllier. So that's how that panned out. But the important thing there was that when Houllier was first contemplated, he was slaughtered in the tabloids because they failed to France failed to qualify the World Cup '94 with him in charge.
Yeah.
And he was slaughtered. 2 weeks later, they thought how good he was. And when he went to Liverpool, which is one day before Englos came to Celtic, they were saying, we had screwed up. What was wrong with us? Why had we not got this guy? So for the start, where he was hopeless in their eyes, when his name first appeared, 2 weeks later, he was a superstar. And we could have done that too, been smarter.
Yeah, I was going to say that shows the advantage. If you give the press maybe a week or two to do their own research, they would realise how well respected Houllier was in the game. They would also have realised how well respected Wim Jansen was and Joe Englos. And we'll get into a wee bit more about those guys just shortly. There's a name, there's a saga in Celtic history which has crept up time after time in this series, Jock. And I've got to be honest with you, when I started the series about the Battle to Save Celtic, the guy's name wasn't even on my radar, but it's Mo Johnston, and it's the Mo Johnston saga. And several folk that I've spoken to, Peter Grant and Tom Grant, the former Celtic director, highlight the Mo Johnston saga as something which had long-term ramifications at Celtic. You know, such was the negativity around it. Everyone knows the story. He had effectively signed for Celtic and he'd done an about turn through the help of his agent Bill McMurdo and signed for Graham Souness's Rangers. But I was surprised just how much that impacted things in future. And I think you've leaned towards the fact that there became a lingering paranoia around the club that you couldn't announce any new signing, whether that was a head coach or a player, until it was 100% belt and braces done. Such was the fear that the club would release any sort of detail and it wouldn't happen. So, for example, had you released details of Wim Jansen a week prior and it fell through, which these deals can fall through, they're quite precarious, the club would have again been made to look foolish. So did you feel that, whether it was spoken in the corridors of Celtic Park or it was just an unspoken fear at the club?
It was unspoken actually, but it was definitely there. There's no question. I was very conscious of it. In fairness, it was articulated once or twice by people saying we can't have another Mo Johnston. So no player gets a mention until he's. I mean, it's the correct thing to do. If a player's registered another club, he shouldn't be talked about by somebody else, and that's a perfectly reasonable position to take. But yeah, there are times when you've got it nailed, and it is nailed, when you could feed it out a bit better. We learned lessons there without question. It was a big mistake to be so successful in keeping names dark. For instance, when Joseph Englos arrived, there was a paper in Scotland, front page lead with a photograph of a manager, exclusive. This is to be the new Celtic manager announced today.
Arthur George.
Aye, never heard of him.
Yeah, just getting the wrong end of the
stick. His name had never been lifted at any time. Don't know anything about him at all. And this was his picture. I can still see it by mind's eye. His picture in this paper. Incredible.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the journalist who writes that is not going to be very happy, is he?
No, you don't look great if that's your statement. It's interesting as well. I suppose now with the benefit of experience and hindsight, you can see both sides of that coin. I think it's right as a club to keep counsel until something's far more concrete and down the line. But likewise, we've just established the fact that maybe at times it doesn't do harm. We'll get to Moravcik shortly, for example, to maybe release a wee bit of detail and let the journalists do their own work. It's a complex situation. In terms of Wim Jansen, on the park we know all about Wim Jansen and what he achieved at Celtic in terms of winning the League Cup initially and then going on to clinch the title and stop the 10 on the last day of the 1998 season. But as we all now know, he decides to move on after just a couple of days after that triumph.
No, he decided to move on before he came.
Yes, we'll get exactly to that. So many of us as fans at that point, I'm there at the game, 9th of May 1998, huge occasion for all of us Celtic persuasion, but we're then kind of stunned. The rumours had been doing the rounds, and 2 or 3 days after he decides to walk away from Celtic. But in fact, I believe that it became very clear to you at an early stage that he only ever intended to stay at Celtic for 1 year, and I think he actually requested a 1 year contract initially. Can you tell us more about that and the moment you realised that he wasn't long term for Celtic?
Well, it certainly was the case that he wanted a 1 year contract. He was quite adamant about that. And Fergus wouldn't entertain it for 1 year contracts. And it looked as though the deal might fall on that. And I said, look, this is nuts. Why would anyone want to come here and do well and leave after a year? So I said, why don't we give him a 3-year contract with 1-year breaks? And we finished up in that compromise. We did a 3-year contract, but it broke after the end of each year on both sides. So we could terminate and he could terminate at no cost or no compensation issues or anything like that. That was the compromise it was reached. And I said to Fergus, listen, if he comes here and does well, there's no way he'll want to leave. Yep. And if he comes here and does badly, well, we've got an exit. So that we're all winners in that score. So I thought that compromise worked well, and Fergus bought that. Initially, wouldn't do the 1-year contract, wouldn't have gone ahead on a 1-year contract. And then once we get into the season, and it's hard to say this, but Wim realised how big the club was. I don't think he did fully realise how big the club was until he was in the situation and he saw that crowd and realised how much profile there was in the club in all aspects of it. It was quite frightening. And we also had very serious competitors. If you remember, I mean, Rangers, who'd spent fortunes and had all these great players and won the league 9 times in a row, were serious competitors. So he's in that situation. And I think he was a wee bit caught in the headlights with that.
And I think, as a guy, and you speak highly of his technical ability, his knowledge on football. I think there's a quote from Johan Cruyff saying Wim Jansen was one of only 4 guys in the world worth listening to in terms of football. Very well respected in the game, but also I think, would it be fair to say introvert by nature, introvert as a character?
Yes.
And I think that is... It's not a great fit for Celtic Football Club. It's just, Celtic are huge and, having lived it and breathed it yourself and you're from this part of the world. There's talented people that have come to Celtic and Rangers, players and coaches, who certainly have the ability, but it's one thing having the ability to be at those clubs. You need a certain temperament and a certain personality. And was that maybe one of the reasons why early on Wim realised it wasn't going to be the fit for him? Well,
I don't know if that, because he decided it wasn't the fit for him for more than 1 year before he came. So he had already that in his head. He didn't seem to want to be anywhere for more than a year. And he's absolutely entitled to that position. It was my misjudgment. It was my judgment that went wrong when I said to Fergus, if he comes here and wins the league, there's no way he'll want to leave here. It's not possible. Why would anybody want to leave having stopped the 10 in a row? And I was wrong about that.
At what point in the 97-98 season did you realise that he wouldn't see more than a year?
About January, I think.
January?
I was convinced by January he wasn't going to stay.
And at that point, Celtic bang in the title race. Paul Lambert and Craig Burley scoring goals against Rangers for a huge win. But at that point, you realised that the writing was potentially on the wall. Am I right in saying as well that Wim had no great interest in any other areas of the football club in terms of youth development? And I read a real interesting tale about his point-blank refusal to go and scout Harold Brattbach in person. So I believe Davy Hayes, chief scout, had seen Brattbach, was a wee bit unsure, a bit unconvinced by him, thought, I think maybe the quote is something like, he'll do all right, he'll maybe score a few goals, something quite flippant like that. And at that point, I think there was a policy in place at the club where if you were spending over 7 figures on any given player, the head coach had to go and watch him.
He had to be seen 6 times.
Had to be seen 6 times.
Alive by members of the staff and at least once by the head coach.
At least once. And I believe you arranged for him to go and watch Harold Brattbach playing for Rosenborg in the Champions League. He refused that invite, if that's the right term for it. He was going to watch Feyenoord Man U instead. Okay. So 2 weeks later, he arranged again for him to go to the next Champions League game. He said, I don't want to miss any training. You went, don't worry about it. We can arrange the private jet. You'll fly in, fly out. No thanks. And then I think at the third time of asking, he just said, now, I'm paraphrasing here, but to the effect of, listen, I'm just not going. So I'm slightly compromised here in that, I was going to say I'm of a generation. There's thousands of fans globally, Celtic fans globally, who will always revere Wim Jansen for what he achieved in a footballing sense. It was a huge achievement to stop the 10, and it was so important to anyone, with Celtic at heart. But there is this other side of the coin where he also had a responsibility and a job to do in terms of supporting, I suppose, the long-term prospects of the club. Scouting a player is one thing, looking at youth players coming through and looking at the bigger picture. I know towards the end of that 97-98 season, you wanted to sit down with them and say, let's review the squad, who stays, who goes, who should we bring in, where's the gaps. And he just wasn't willing to do that. And from that point of view, and this is all fairly new information to me since reading your book and some other articles, but I think everyone would also see the difficulty that must have, given you in terms of trying to plan for the future.
Well, huge difficulties, because there's two things involved there. One, you've got a manager who's not doing his job, or a head coach who's not doing his job fully, properly. And I'm his line manager, and I'm supposed to make that happen. And I've got to answer to somebody else who's not at all happy, that's to put it mildly. Mm-hmm. And that's why I had to say to Fergus, we need to go on a policy of appeasement until this league is over. We've got to win this league, whatever it takes, we've got to win the league. And if it means we've got to sacrifice that, we need to do it. And to be fair to him, he went along with that because it was a very difficult thing to do. You've got a guy, an employee who's not doing his job, basically not doing his job at all. Mm-hmm. And we're compromising that in the interests of the very short-term purpose, which is top 10 in a row, which seemed to me pretty important.
Yeah, I'd say it was. Did you and Fergus both, to an extent, have to bite your tongue during those times? Were there things that you probably wanted to say, but you just had to hold back for fear of rocking the boat?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
How hands-on was Fergus at that time? So obviously, I think a huge part in creating the role of general manager was to provide a buffer between Fergus and the manager. I think it's fairly well known that he and Tommy Burns didn't see eye to eye. Fergus had his priorities, Tommy had his. And I think lessons were learned from that, and that's why the role was created. So obviously you would be taking the lead.
Could I say that just before I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
On the Tommy Burns thing, when I first spoke to him, I said, if I'm coming here, I want Tommy Burns back.
Right.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about? I said, I understand. Could you explain to me what had happened with Tommy? Mm-hmm. I said, all the things you've described that are being a problem with Tommy would not be a problem if I was between you, if I buffered it. Mm-hmm. And I got on very well with him, and I think he's a great coach, and I think he puts great teams on the pitch, and I'd love to have him in the club. And I said, I think, and my first choice of all of these things you're saying about, I'd bring him back with Billy Stark, bring the two of them back. Mm-hmm. We can't do that, And I said, well, that's what I'd like to do in the ideal world.
And you know, I think the principle of that's spot on. Obviously, it might have been too soon. I think Tommy was relieved of his duties in April. You came in around about the June time. But I'm glad that time saw fit for Tommy Burns to return to Celtic. It was the right place for Tommy Burns to be, and I'm glad that however long it took that situation was resolved. But in terms of you providing that buffer, was it left to you specifically to have these what I presume were challenging conversations with Wim Jansen, or did Fergus ever get hands on with that?
No, Fergus didn't get hands on at all with that. That was down to me. But I had to report to him all the time, so he had to know what was going on. And I did report to him, and he did know what was going on, and he was getting very irate about it. But he didn't interfere in any way with that.
And I was going to say, so obviously you were effectively, just to simplify, you were Vim's line manager.
Yep.
But Fergus in turn was your manager. Did he give you full autonomy, whether it was with the Vim situation or most other situations during your 510 days? Did he give you the freedom, for the most part, to carry out your job?
Freedom is the wrong word. I certainly was left to my own devices, but I had to keep reporting and frequently explaining, because there's things I wanted to do, and he said, I don't think that's a good idea. Mm-hmm. And I'd have to try and persuade him. And sometimes I did, and sometimes I didn't. Mm-hmm. I won some arguments, I lost some arguments. What was good about working with him was he expected you to challenge him all the time. He expected you to do that and create arguments. But at the end of the day, he made the decision. Yeah. And you had to go with that.
Of course, and that's business, that's life. Many folk certainly will speak or have a perception of Fergus as being fairly stubborn, and I think that's fair to say, but you've mentioned just there, at times would he very much hear out an opinion, whether it's from yourself or a colleague at the time, and if he felt it was right, he would change his mind on occasion? Yes,
definitely. There was one clear example I had when I was at the point of resigning. He gave me an instruction in relation to a player. And I said to him, that's wrong. He said, no, you can't do that. No, that's not appropriate. And we had a real wing-dinging argument. I mean, we had a big debate about it for a long time. And eventually he says, no, that's it. No, that's what I want done. Get it done. And I argued all afternoon with him because it was 6 o'clock when he normally left, and that was him going home. And I went home, it's like, I'm not doing that. I'm just not doing it, which means I've got to resign. So I went home and I sat down and I wrote a handwritten thing. I remember it was lined A4 pages and I had 3.5 pages I hand wrote, setting out my argument against what he was wanting done. And I wouldn't have it typed because nobody else would see it. It was just between him and me. And I went in the first thing in the morning. How are you this morning? Usual bright and breezy. And I said, I'm fine. I said, but look, I've got a wee note. I'd like you to read that thing we were talking about last night. I'd like you to have a look at this. And he said, well, you sit down, I'll read it. I said, no. I said, I'm plenty to do. I'll see you at lunchtime. You digest that. And off I went. And I thought, it's my last morning in the club. I'm finished. That's me. And lunchtime, he came to me, sharp at lunchtime. Right, go for lunch. Come on, wait to Alfred for lunch. And he said, read your note. I said, I hoped you might. And he said, you clearly feel very strongly about this. I said, yeah, I do. He says, right, okay. He said, I don't agree with you, but do it your way. I thought, I'm not finished today. So anyway, we did it my way. About 6 weeks later, in the context of somebody else, oh, by the way, he said that thing about so-and-so. You were right. That was all. The end of it.
Yeah, and stubborn in many ways, and I think his stubbornness was huge what led to the success and the legacy he's left at Celtic, but also good to hear that on times when it's the right call, he was happy to concede. You know, that's you've got to have compromise in life, haven't you? And it's good to hear that.
Well, with huge bargains about bonuses, I mean, that was another thing we fought about. I didn't think he read the psyche of footballers. He didn't understand footballers, you know.
This is something that's been levelled at Fergus. I try to recall who in the series was speaking about it, but basically, yeah, you know, it's kind of that disconnect where Fergus had the long-term vision, the 5-year plan about the infrastructure and what he was going to build and subsequently leave behind at Celtic, whereas Tommy Burns, for example, his burning desire was to win the title and stop Rangers extending their, at the time, 8 or 9 in a row. And they were just on different pages, and I think, whether it was Tommy or others, there was a real wish that Fergus had potentially pushed the boat out a wee bit in terms of some signings. There's maybe a signing that I'd like to speak to you about just shortly in the piece as well, if you're happy to share. Just in terms of the playing side of things, almost immediately on arrival, you've got to deal with the exits of some big characters, namely Paolo Di Canio and George Cadetti. And I think while all of us as football fans can see the talents that these guys had, I think we can also see that they would be very challenging personalities to deal with. Can you tell us a wee bit about your dealings with these two players?
Well, they're two different people for me. I mean, I've got no time for Di Canio, but I've got a lot of time for Cadetti still. Di Canio was a nightmare, a complete nightmare to deal with. And just wouldn't implement his contract, basically. And wouldn't go to the training when he should go to the training. He wouldn't go to tours. He wouldn't go to Holland. He went to Holland, wouldn't go to Ireland. He made up his mind where he was going to be. I said to him, I says, all right for Jackie McNamara trains in Musselburgh and Tom Boyd goes into Strathclyde Park and Alan Stubbs goes into Troon Beach. And is that a football club you're talking about? You know, and he's, well, I don't understand. You know, I suddenly didn't understand. It was just a nightmare.
And I think we've seen over the years how, I'm going to say challenging and just leave it at that, Paolo Di Canio can be extremely talented footballer. Fantastic
player. George Cadet, who was also a fantastic player, was a different kettle of fish. He had domestic issues, which prevented him coming back here. Because we agreed a deal. The deal was done for him to come back on a 4-year contract. I left Portugal with Jack Mulhern, the club doc, who was very close to him. I took him with me for that reason. And we had a very, very pleasant session with George Cadet, in which we agreed a new contract for him to come back. Jack was cock-a-hoop in the way back. I said, Jack, don't get excited. That's what I said. His wife was there, never came to see us, never spoke to us. He said, there's still trouble to come. And sure enough, landed a player arrived at Glasgow Airport with messages on my phone.
Yeah, I think you'd envisage the problems there, and you speak very highly of George Cadetti, another extremely talented footballer. You'd gone to see him. I believe he was suffering from some mental health issues at the time, which
I think that's likely. Yeah. I'm not a doctor, but
and more more spoken of. There's less of a stigma around that side of the game now, but there's no doubt players over the years, may have had their challenges, and potentially George Cadetti. But you've had a very productive meeting with him. He was keen to remain at Celtic, but it wasn't to be, and I think his partner at the time decided that wasn't for them, and Celtic miss out. And it's hard for you, Jock, because you arrive under immediate pressure and you lose two such personalities. That leaves you on the back foot from a time. Again...
And Wim Jansen later on thought I also was responsible for Van Hooydonk, which I wasn't.
Getting the blame for that one too. I was going to come back to Fergus just briefly in terms of, I suppose your job in large part is to bridge that gap between Fergus and the footballing side of things. You've got experience in that part of the world. You would certainly have more of a handle on how footballers operate, how they think, through Craig, your brother, as much as anybody. But there's lots of facets of your life which cross the footballing world. Again, was Fergus happy to take your lead? So there's an interesting situation where Wim Jansen demands he wants Reggie Blinker from Sheffield Wednesday, but also wants Paulo Di Canio. But it's just not possible because Paulo's effectively on strike.
Yeah, he's down in tools,
and he's saying he's not making a move. You spoke to David Pleat at Sheffield Wednesday, and eventually, after some back and forth, he says, "Okay, you can have Reggie Blinker, but we are taking Di Canio." So you half achieve what Wim Jansen wants. And I believe, again, he was particularly difficult around that time. He wasn't best pleased. He basically said, "I want both." And that was the bottom line.
Yeah, that's what he said. I want both. I kept saying, "Look, you want Blinker, I can only get Blinker." The Canio goes, "I want them both." I said, "Well, we can't have them both." And at the moment we can't have any of them because the Canio won't turn up. So you've got nothing at the moment. We could get Blinker. You want Blinker, I can get him for you. But I need to deal the Canio into this.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't want. I want them both. I was just
a no-win situation, or a part-win situation. You got Reggie, but you lost the Canio. Before I forget to ask, obviously we were speaking about Fergus a wee bit there in terms of how he is as a personality, the fact that he was happy to give you autonomy, very generally speaking, in your role. I'd like to mention Peter McLean. Peter McLean was long-term PR at Celtic, someone who I believe you're still pretty close with. And I had some contact with Peter as part of this series, and he said that aside from the finances, the very important finances that Fergus brought to Celtic, he also had a very unique set of skills that included integrity, vision, intelligence and work ethic, amongst others. I think you yourself described Fergus in the book as razor sharp. Would you agree with the comments that Peter made in terms of Fergus's unique skill set?
Absolutely. He had all these, yeah.
Yeah. Easy to see from an early stage that he had all these skills to offer.
I knew before I went, they had these.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to say, as someone who worked as closely with him as maybe anyone, during his time at Celtic, would he relax at times, or was he the same with you on day one as day 510?
Probably the same, but he also had a sixth sense about him. I mentioned in the book, and an occasion when it was particularly wild at the time. It was all nonsense. There was press were going nuts about all sort of things, and he wandered into me one day and said, "Right, come on, take me for lunch. We're going for lunch. Pick a restaurant. We're going for lunch." And we were out for about 3 hours for lunch, and he never mentioned Celtic, football, anything. And he obviously decided we needed that break, and we needed that total relaxation. And he was great company, terrific company. He was funny, he was entertaining, told story after story, nothing to do with the football. Uh-huh. And it was obviously a reading on his part of the fact that we needed that break. We also used to do things like walk around the stadium. Mm-hmm. We go for a walk around the park. When things were going kind of crazy and nuts, come on, go for a walk, and we'll just walk around it, just chatting the way around. He was remarkable that way.
It's been mentioned a few times that he had a genuine sense of humour. It's not something that we've seen as fans a lot, and I think from my perceptions, outside looking in, Fergus seems a relatively guarded personality. But by all accounts, he does have a bit of humour about him.
Definitely. Oh no, he's a good sense of humour. Yeah, he's funny. Aye. But only when he feels like it.
Well, that's it. Funny, but on his terms. Let's get back to some of the hands-on stuff you had to deal with. We've spoken about a couple of high-profile exits there. I want to speak about some incomings, and there's some real high-profile characters to speak about. I think during your time you were responsible for bringing in 13 players to the club.
I was involved in 13, aye.
Pretty short space of time. Amongst them there's big characters, big figures like Craig Burley, Paul Lambert, Harold Bratback that we've spoken about, but also easily two of the best players ever to pull on a Celtic shirt. This isn't debatable. It's Henrik Larsson and it's Lubo Moravcik. Can you tell us first of all all about the Larsson deal and the challenges you faced in getting him to the club?
Well, that was at the time Vimy arrived. I said to him, "Are there any players out there that we should be looking at?" And he said, "I want two. I want Vimy and I want Henrik Larsson and Reggie Blinker. They were the only two players he asked for when he arrived." I said, "Tell me about Larsson. What's the score with Larsson?" He said, "Is it Feyenoord? But he's not. The coach doesn't treat him properly. Plays him in the wrong positions, and it's not working. And he's keen to get out." And I said, "Well, that's great." He said, "And I think he's got an escape clause in his contract." I said, "Well, okay, who's his agent?" So I get hold of the agent, and the agent initially would not speak to us at all because he was Van Hooydonk's agent. And he said, "I'm not speaking to Celtic. I don't have anything to do with Celtic." And I said, "Look, we're not talking to Celtic. Talk to me. I wasn't involved. I don't know about Van Hooydonk. Fergus McCann. I won't speak to Fergus McCann. I won't speak to him." I said, "Well, you don't need to speak to him. It's not required. Let's start from scratch."
Yeah.
And I persuaded them on that basis to allow me to go to Amsterdam and try and hack a deal for. But he then told me that there was a clause in his contract allowing him to go for 2 million guilders, which was £650,000.
Mm-hmm.
But they were trying to exercise that clause and the club resisted it and said that wasn't binding. And there was a tribunal fixed in Holland. And I said to him, "Well, can you show me the clause in the contract?" Show me the contract. And I said, "I'm going to get it translated." And then I've got to find out what I think in Dutch law would apply here. So I had to do all that. And I got the contract, got it translated, looked at the contract, made contact with Dutch lawyers to try and interpret the thing properly. And I had then to report back to the board whether or not we had to do the deal. In the meantime, Feyenoord was saying, "We'll compromise, split the difference, give us $1.5 million," and that kind of thing, pounds. And I had to finish up, get out, put a neck in the block by going and saying to the board, "I think we should sit tight. I think he'll win the tribunal. So let's sit tight." And of course, then I'm delayed a transfer, haven't I?
Yeah, and that's...
So we sit tight on that, and they win the tribunal, and we do the deal at 650,000.
And what's really interesting as well, and maybe in a similar way to Wim Jansen's announcement or his appointment, the response amongst the media and the Celtic fan base to Henrik Larsson signing for 650 grand was pretty underwhelming. We obviously didn't know then what we know now. He then has that debut where he tees up Chick Charnley for a goal for Hibs, but the rest is of course history. But you made the point that we were in that world, that was 97. We were in that world then, and we're in this world now, where unless you're spending big millions on players that are household names, then it's a fair... Who knew Kyogo Furuhashi, not that long ago, and various other guys you'd care to mention. But signings shouldn't solely be judged on what you paid and whether you know them or not, should they?
Absolutely right. Yeah. Well, the second great player you're talking about,
yes,
is the best example of all.
I think the best example of all time. So Luba Moravcik, of course. So Dr. Joe Venglos comes in again, underwhelming, or at least to those who are not in the know, of which I was very much one of them. You get you spoke about the Wim Jansen headline, the second worst thing to hit Hiroshima, a disgraceful headline, a shameful headline. And then for Joe Venglos, you get Doctor Who, people questioning Dr. Joe Venglos' appointment. But he's clearly a very talented operator. He'd managed at a World Cup for Czechoslovakia in 1990, held various managerial positions over, I think, a 30-year managerial career at that point, high positions in FIFA, just hugely respected figure. And he arrives at the club and he says, "There's this fella we should potentially look at, Luba Moravcik, but I don't know if it's the right move PR-wise. He's a fellow Slovak and he's 33 years of age, so maybe we shouldn't do it." And I believe to a huge extent, you had to talk him into it by saying, if he's good enough and if he's still got the legs and the fitness to do a job, we should go and do it. And I think you went to watch him play against Portugal for his country. Can you tell us about that?
Well, that's absolutely right, yes. He said, the lovely story about it, I said to him after he'd looked at the squad, I said, "Right, come on, tell me, what's the verdict? What do you think of the squad?" He says, "It's a good squad." He said, "We're going to have problems until about November because of 10 players being at the World Cup." He said, "We'll not get a full return until about November for the whole squad." He said, but the only thing I'd say is that a great team has 3 players who can deliver the surprising moment.
Yeah.
That was the phrase. He said, a good team has got 2, and we have only got 1, and that's Larsson.
Mm-hmm.
He said, we need another player who can deliver a surprising moment. I said, well, any ideas? He says, well, yes, I have, but I don't think we can do the deal. I said, well, who are you talking about? And he said, Lubomir Moravcik, and I'm thinking, never heard of him. And I'm ashamed of myself because I've done lots of European football and I've covered lots of European football, and I thought I had a very good knowledge of good players in Europe. I'd never heard of him. I said, well, tell me about it. Well, he's Slovakian, but he's playing in France and now in Germany at Duisburg. And well, he gave me the whole story about him. So I said to him, well, why are we not doing this? He's too old. I mean, he's 33. Yeah, you'll get slaughtered. So will I. Get slaughtered for taking him in. At that age, no one's heard of him and all that. And I said, Joseph, can he deliver a surprising moment? He said, he certainly can. He said, if he hasn't lost his legs. He said, so. I said, well, I think I'll take the flak. I don't care. If it's going to make us better, I'll take it. Oh, he says, you got a terrible stick for it. I said, look, well, let's go and do it. Mm-hmm. I said, but we need to make sure the legs work. And he said, right. So he came back to me and said, right, I found out he's playing against Portugal in Bratislava. We'll go and watch him. And I went out with him. Mm-hmm. And he played captain of Slovakia, number 11. Took the free kicks, took the throw-ins, took the by-kicks, did everything against a terrific Portuguese team. It was far too good for them. If he'd played for them, it would have been 20-0, I think. And a terrible, filthy wet night. The conditions were awful. And for 90 minutes, after 15 minutes, I've got a hold of Joseph. I'm saying, I've got to sign him. Mm-hmm. And he says, let's say that after 90 minutes. Yeah. And I did. I've got to sign him.
And you had a situation as well, I think, after he signed. So, I mean, again, disrespectful. What was the line? Dud check, even though he was
Celtic signed dud check.
Yeah.
So everything's wrong about that except Celtic signed him.
Yeah. And you've even got some of the first team players were a bit unsure, who's this guy that we've signed? And I think your chat to them was, watch him in training. He's training on Monday, have a look and come back and see me. And I think they were blown away. You spoke about the line from Joe Venglos, does he have that surprising moment? He had 2 surprising moments against Rangers and a 5-0 win. And I think on a personal note, you were particularly pleased for both the player and Joe Venglos at the vindication it gave them at that moment.
100%, yeah. And little Lubo, he knew the score when he came. He knew he was coming into that difficulty. Mm-hmm. But he had terrific confidence as well. I mean, he knew he could play. He was a great character, terrific character.
Phenomenal character. And as I say, easily, Henrik Larsson, Lubomir Moravcik, certainly amongst the most talented of modern times at Celtic, but of all times, I think everyone would.
It was funny too. He took me from, I went to Duisburg to get him, and did the deal, and I had to go back to Dusseldorf Airport from Duisburg. It's about an hour, and he said, I'll run you. And I said, oh, great, that's great. I'm saying that, by the way, he hadn't a word of English, not one word, but I've got a bit of German, so he was doing it in German. But he told me in the car, I start to learn English now. So he would point to things and I'd say tree and he'd say tree. So he started learning the language in that journey from Duisburg to Dusseldorf Airport.
Yeah, just really keen to embrace that chapter in his life. Just a brilliant guy. We've had him on the show actually. He's a phenomenal character and what a talent. I'm going to get back to Joe Venglos just shortly, but there is one player that you couldn't quite get to Celtic. And I'd like to ask you about him because I've seen your quotes. I know for a time you hadn't mentioned the player, but I think the story is maybe out and about there now. And you described this guy, he was going to be a potential game changer in so many ways for Celtic in terms of what he could bring, and actually as a player and potentially beyond. You had a deal agreed in principle, some big numbers involved, but the stumbling block was he was at the top end of his career, and Fergus wasn't quite willing to bend on the profile of players that you should have been signing at the time. Do you want to tell us a bit about that, and if you're happy to do so, to reveal who the player was? Yeah,
the issue was the player was 33 years old, and normally that would, well, so was Lubo, right enough, so that wasn't an issue. But Lubo was involved no money virtually. I mean, it was pennies for Lubo. But we're talking about serious money for this guy, and serious salary. But I was looking at that time for the game changer. long-term game changer. And I saw this guy as a Pied Piper kind of player, the player that would transform the whole place because he was top-notch, acknowledged worldwide as top-notch, had a terrific attitude, trained like a beast, would encourage all the kids and would bring them all on. He had a great atmosphere about him, apparently, with young players at his clubs. And I thought, this is Taylor, this is Cantona at Manchester United kind of influence sort of stuff. So I cracked the deal, I got the deal, I got his agent, the deal sorted, and was told he was really enthusiastic about the whole project. And then had to go to Fergus, of course. And I'd tell Fergus, no, I can't possibly pay that kind of money for a 33-year-old. That's out of the question, you know. And we had real set to argument. And he eventually agreed to think about it overnight, which I'm beginning to be hopeful that it might happen. And he came in the following morning. No, I said, no, I can't. No, I've thought about it. I can't do it. No, can't do it. So we didn't get Gianluca Vialli.
Imagine Gianluca Vialli and Henrik Larsson up top for Celtic. Yeah. I think you described it as it would have been a real game changer for you. But was it, certainly in terms of, in a footballing sense, was it one of your big disappointments from your time that you couldn't get over the line?
Big time.
Yeah.
Oh, very disappointed.
You should have taken Fergus for one of those wee walks around the park.
Oh, I did. I did.
Tried all the tricks. What a move that would have been. But it wasn't to be. But just to come back to Joe Venglos, as I've mentioned, I've given you, his background there, mentioned his credentials. A really talented guy. You faced a similar situation that when he was revealed to the press, again, it was like, who's this guy? Why did we not get heads up on him? And maybe didn't get the week or two to do the research, which would have formed a more positive opinion on him. But just generally speaking, potentially Jock more as a guy than a football manager. I think you were incredibly fond of Joe Venglos. Sadly passed away in 2021 there, but an extremely talented man. And
I've said elsewhere, the finest man ever out in my life. Right.
You can't say more than that. What was it about him that made you so fond of him?
His inherent warmth, decency, integrity, humour, charm. He had everything. He was just a delightful guy to be near.
Mm-hmm. But just a very talented operator. I had to laugh. There's a section in the book where there was some journalists questioning his maybe limited English at the time. He was maybe not fluent in English, and then you says, well, if you want to, you can maybe speak to him in one of the 7 other languages he holds, and that was that Russian, Polish,
That's another mistake I made. One of these smart comments, that just rebound on you. Yeah. And I couldn't resist it at the time, but I should have, because it wasn't going to do me any good.
Maybe so, but no, a very talented operator, Joe Venglos, and as I say, someone that you speak incredibly highly of. Just in terms of that, I suppose that press hostility, Jock, if that's the right term for it, whether it was a Wim Jansen situation, Joe Venglos, a perceived failure to sign various players in time, was it fair to say that there was a bit of a vendetta, if that's not too strong a word, from the press, and particularly given that maybe there was the poacher turned gamekeeper or other way around? You'd been in the broadcast media, you were now on the other side of the fence. Do you think that caused resentment amongst some?
Well, I was told that, and I think there might be something in it. I don't know. I think the very fact that I was privy to so much information that wasn't being imparted was upsetting a lot of people, really. Mm-hmm. It's the pen's mightier than the sword, and the pen did me in, basically. And I didn't. I made plenty of mistakes. I'm not arguing that at all. Certainly in dealing with the media, I made mistakes, and it made it inevitable. I had to go.
Did the abuse at some point become particularly personal? And if so, how do you deal with that? And beyond that, was it even to the point of death threats on some occasions?
Yeah, there were death threats. Yeah, there were. I don't know how serious they came to the club, got them, and they were referred on to appropriate authorities. I didn't get them one-to-one to me, but apparently there were problems of that kind. Yeah, I mean, if you look back on that, I think there are people out there in the media who should be utterly ashamed of themselves for some of the stuff that they perpetuated. But that's not going to change anything, and I didn't handle it, I think, as well as I should have done and I could have done in terms of making the appropriate adjustments to make it more workable. But it was quite clear from the outset that a number of them, in certain elements of the media, were determined to get me out the door. And when they are like that in that situation, they will succeed. There's not any doubt about that. They will succeed. Because I'm going to see supporters, and supporters who read papers, read tabloids with all the poison. And then they meet you and they say, well, you're not actually not the kind of guy that we've read about in the paper. And I says, well, the guy you read about in the paper is somebody else. It's a fictional character. It was really quite severe in that sense. And a shocking indictment on only a percentage, by the way, it wasn't all of them. Mm-hmm. I made reference to the huddle used for press conference. And then certain journalists would go into a huddle afterwards to decide what they're going to write. So they all wrote the same poison and nonsense, frequently totally unrelated to what happened at the press conference. But they all did it. So that all the editors thought it must be right. Mm-hmm. And the people thought it must be right. Supporters thought it must be right because they were all writing that. The fact that it was complete fiction, they couldn't possibly know. We knew, but what can you can protest about it, but you're wasting your time.
And I think you mentioned somewhere as well, Joe Venglos at times would hold court for an hour and a half, speak in great detail about various aspects of football, and one comment would be taken completely out of context. Venglos would leave the press conference thinking, that was great, all good, positive stuff. Next day, really negative headlines. And I think that's one small example. I know you've experienced that a lot in terms of...
I explained to him the huddle operation, and he was quite bemused by that. Mm-hmm. The huddle operator, he couldn't believe that would happen. But Harold Brackback was another one. He gave an interview at one time, which I was there. I heard every word he uttered. And the huddle, the following day, said, Harold Brackback said it's all right to finish Celtic. They said second to Rangers. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was just incredible. I mean, nothing like that was said at any time by Harold Brackback, who then decided, I'm not speaking against the papers.
Yeah, and just clams up. You've mentioned that there's potentially, and you've conceded you've maybe made mistakes of your own and you could maybe have dealt with things differently professionally. But how do you deal with that personal abuse? And, you've mentioned, the death threats, however serious they may or may not have been. You've got family, you've got children, Jock. How do you handle that? And you're like, at that point, you're early 50s, an experienced operator in business and in life, but how do you handle that?
Well, you have to be quite resilient, I think. But one of the things I did was I didn't read any papers. I mean, everything I'm telling you, Peter McLean, who did a great job, by the way, and I have a high regard for Peter, he would tell me what I needed to know in the morning papers. You better know this, you better know that. That was how I knew what was in the papers. And of course, he was frequently utterly upset. I can't believe this, because he was at press conferences all the time, and he knew what was said and he saw what was written, so he knew what was going on. So there was that background. No, I because I hadn't read the stuff directly, although I knew it was happening and I could tell the feedback from supporters and people. I knew it was all bad news in that sense. But I was absolutely insistent in doing what I thought was right all the time. And one thing I can say to anybody, I'll say to you, I'll say to anybody else ever, I spent 510 days at Celtic. Not one occasion did I do anything in my own interests. Never any time did I do any of my own interests. Everything I did was done in the interest of Celtic Football Club.
Yeah, and I've read the very line on it.
And I'm never going to deviate from that. And that is how I cope with it. Because my conscience is absolutely clear about that. It doesn't mean I didn't make mistakes, I did. But the mistakes were honest mistakes. And they were, at the time, were designed to be in the interest of Celtic Football Club. And that is how I conducted myself from start to finish. I could have looked after myself far better. I could have made a lot of money. I was offered money to give information. I could have made fortunes doing that. I could have done all sorts of things to look after me. I didn't, and I wouldn't, and I'm delighted I didn't.
Yeah, and it sounds like your conscience is very clear on that. Just a couple of things of a similar note. Speaking of the media, very much carrying the message. Listen, we now live in very different times, Jock, in 2024 in terms of social media, clubs being able to communicate directly with their fan base. But back around those times, you've got the again, the really poor situation where Fergus is booed when he's unfurling the flag at Celtic Park, August 98. There's a further situation. There's an AGM, I think, that year. Someone gets up and shouts at Fergus, "What have you ever done for this club?" Incredible stuff. And you also made a statement around about that time that history would prove Fergus to be just as important to Celtic as Jock Stein is. I completely agree with that, and I think many others do now.
But don't forget the key part of that. What I said was never reported. What I said was, in the year 2050, when people reflect on the history of Celtic, they'll have Jock Stein and Fergus McCann as the two top men.
And when that was quoted then, did they just remove the 2050 bit? Yeah. And it's become first. So now we're 2024, and I think most, if not all, of Celtic's fans revere Jock Stein and Fergus. They revere them differently for what they brought, but equally important in terms of where Celtic stand. Just, to kind of finish on this, point of the recording, is there any kind of standout examples of just simply untruths that were told about you in the media? There's a story, or there's the story that you wanted to take the credit for the League Cup success and you wanted to walk off the bus holding that trophy aloft. Can you tell us about that one, for example?
Well, yeah, it was, that was how it was reported in one Sunday paper. Said that I had to be persuaded not to be first off the bus with the trophy because I was insisting in doing that. Utter nonsense. Everybody on the bus knew was nonsense because I travelled the team bus and routinely was last off when we arrived and last off when we got back to Celtic Park. Never get involved in that at all. The trophy, we had the trophy in that trip from Ibrox to Celtic Park after the League Cup win. And even to the point where Tom Boyd was going up the bus and they'd filled the champagne in the trophy. And he came up, and I always sat in the bus with Jack Mulhern, the doctor. And he came up to the two of us and said, "Oh, guys, come on, you have a drink?" I said, no, it's sat back. No, guys, you guys want. And Tom insisted, "Oh, you've got to take a sip out," which we both eventually did after resisting initially. Because no, the players won this, we didn't win anything, you won it. And the idea of coming off the bus, other than at the end, it was just unthinkable.
So yeah, so it's just another one that's completely untrue.
Completely untrue.
Was there lots of situations like that? Yeah. And the journalist would never think to pick up a phone to you or Peter McLean just to get the Celtic side on it?
No.
Just run with the headline, see what happens.
I mean, that was all. There was also the headline which I had to sue on was one that said Jock Brown told us to lie.
Vidar Riseth
transfer, yeah. Now that left me with no option but to sue, because as a lawyer, if you're convicted of telling someone to lie, you get struck off. You lose your livelihood. So I hadn't any option at all, and sued the paper immediately on that. And that was Jock Brown told us to lie was one day. The following morning was Jock Brown sues I don't mention the paper. We'll see you in court. And when, of course, the case was settled with significant damages and all sorts of extra stuff, never reported to anywhere.
Yeah, and rather at the time than checking with the player involved, Riseth or his agent or Celtic, let's just run with the headline because it makes for good press.
To be fair to the journalist, well, the story wasn't flattering to me. It didn't actually say that. The headline writer got it wrong. The other thing is that you remember every article that appears in a paper, especially a tabloid, is legal. Lawyers read it all because they're so close to the bone all the time. They check it. So I knew that one had been legal in a manner that the actual story itself was not actionable. It was only the headline. The likelihood is that the lawyer doing the checking the story never saw the headline.
I always find that fascinating. It applies to this day that any given journalist will put his name to an article, however long that might be. He'll write what he wants to an extent, and it's some other individual that's responsible for the headline. For me, it takes a responsibility away from if you're the journalist of the piece, I think you should be responsible for writing the headline. I really do, because otherwise it's a nameless somebody hiding behind the fact, and it just ends up a bit murky, as we can see from that example. However, it seemed to be par for the course, unfortunately, at that time. By September 98, Jock, you realise that your time is coming to an end at Celtic, and you express this to Fergus, who I think is a bit taken aback initially. Can you tell us his response at that time and why you yourself thought it was the right time to go?
Well, I raised it with him in September 98. I said, look, this can't continue because everything I was doing was turned and twisted and negative. And I said, can you come on, look at this? I said, my time's up. I thought I'd make 2 years. I said, I'm not going to make 2 years. And not at all. No, we're not allowing these people to decide what we're doing, all that sort of stuff. You know, so he was totally resistant to it. But it became clearer and clearer all the time. And by November, it was quite clear. I had to go.
Yeah, so you do eventually leave the club in November 98, and you felt disappointed. It's one of the last things you mentioned about. You felt disappointed as you felt it was a time in your life, in your career, that you were most capable of handling such a role and such a responsibility. So what were your overall feelings when you eventually left Celtic Park for the last time?
I was very sad about it. I mean, there was no doubt about that. I was sad. I knew it was inevitable, but it was sad. It was because I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the job. I enjoyed going into Celtic Park was a delight. Going into the place, you walk in the front door, and everybody in the place. It was a happy building. Mm-hmm. It was a really good place to work. And I realised that come to an end. And I knew why it had come to an end. I knew it had come to an end because of the media issues. And I found that particularly sad too, that they'd effectively won. They had won. There's no doubt about that. Mm.
You mentioned you had lots of support internally from many colleagues as well as players and coaches at that time. Tell us briefly about a lady called Betty Pride and the loyalty that she showed you.
Sadly no longer with us either. No, Betty was my PA when I was a solicitor in Motherwell, and worked with her very closely at that time. And when I left that firm, I took her with me. I took her with me to 2 different places after that. And when I went to Celtic, she's football daft, by the way, by nature. I said to Fergus, look, I've got someone I'd like to bring with me. I told him about her. He said, right, I'll bring her in too. So she came with me to Celtic and was there all the time. The players loved her, by the way. I mean, they absolutely loved her. And after I left, I spoke to Billy Davis, who was manager of Motherwell at the time, and I said, do yourself a favour, there's a girl who lives round the corner here that would just transform your life as a manager. Bring her in. And that's Julie happened, and she went there, and she was there till, sadly, she passed away in 2009.
Yeah, and I believe Celtic were quite keen to retain her services.
I sat at a meeting with Fergus and Eric Riley after about. I was going out when I was serving 2 weeks' notice, which didn't actually pan out. But I was supposed to work in notice, and it was impossible to work notice. Everybody kept coming in, and all the players, everybody kept coming in. I waste my time here. You know, this is impossible. But Betty, immediately when I was going, I told Betty I was going. She said, "Well, I'm coming with you. I'm going to." I said, "No, I'm not going to another job. You've got a job here, and they love you here, and you're doing a great job. Stay here." Mm-hmm. And no, I'm not going. So then Fergus and Eric Riley and I sat with her, trying to persuade her to stay, and we failed. She insisted on going.
She wasn't having it. She sounds like a great person, great personality, and very kind.
And she typed that book.
Right. Okay. Was she the instigator of that? So great personality, great for you to speak so highly of her during your time together. There's a quote again towards the end of the book. So the book was published in 1999, I believe, Jock, around that time, and it goes as follows: "The club will flourish, let there be no doubt about that. Fergus McCann was absolutely the right man, perhaps the only man, to lead Celtic out of the abyss in March 1994. But I think a different style of leadership may now be required to take the club on an expansionist future. My own view is that the miracles of the past 5 years have served to rescue the organisation, but have only scratched the surface of the club's potential. The club makes a worldwide impact which can and must now be harnessed." And when you look now, Jock, as I say, 2024 at the modern day Celtic, almost 30 years on from that very quote, I think it's fair to say that the club has come some distance since those days.
It has, yeah, it certainly has. I would like to think it might have gone further, but it certainly has moved on.
One thing you did mention back then was that the way the club communicated with fans had to be better. And as I say, the world has changed in the last 30 years. Social media being one thing, the internet and everything that comes with it. Do you think that the communication from the club is or has been vastly improved from your time, keeping in mind that back in your days, you almost had to rely solely on the media carrying the message, and as you say, if they want you gone, you're gone eventually. They had all the power back then. Do you feel Celtic have now addressed those comms issues in the right way?
I don't know fully because I'm not really in touch with that, and in a lot of ways it's beyond my comprehension, the clever stuff they can now do. It appears to me as though they're certainly trying to move in that direction, but I'm the wrong person to give a real valid opinion on that.
That's fair, okay. Last quote, Jock, from yourself, again, summing up your time at Celtic. People have asked me countless times if I regretted leaving my safe, comfortable professional life in the law and broadcasting to join Celtic. The answer is always the same. I don't regret going to Celtic for 1 second. That was written in 1999, 25 years or so ago. Does the answer remain the same to this day?
Absolutely the same.
Yeah. Any regrets at all of any nature?
Oh, just some of the mistakes I made, but apart from that, not at all, no.
Yeah, but you don't regret going to Celtic for a single second. What does life look like now, Jock? Are you happily enjoying retirement? You've mentioned Hamilton Accies, who won a playoff there just during the week. Do you still enjoy watching football and following football, even after spending such a large part of your professional life working in the game? Oh yes, I still like to go to games and see a lot of football, and I'm more perhaps following it in television than in reality, but because you've got the travelling issues and you can see more games if you sit in the house, can't you? But I'm still following it avidly. Can you relax more watching football than you ever could when you were working in that world?
Oh, aye, definitely. I can remember actually the day you talked about beating St Johnstone to win the league and stop it 10 in a row. I can remember the feeling, and I can still remember vividly that feeling. It was a slumped in that chair, and it was a massive pile of relief. It was above all else at that time for me, even though I knew there was real trouble coming. I knew that it was just the beginning of real issues for me. But I remember a good friend of mine said during the week before, he said, I hate to say this, but I hope you lose on Saturday. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, no, he says, for your sake. Because if you lose on Saturday, they'll string Wim Jansen up from the yardarm. If you win, they'll string you up. And I've said, listen, in that case, I'll take the stringing up because we've got to win the league.
Yeah. I kind of know one situation, damned if you do, damned if you don't. But yeah, that very day, I think a real mixture of joy and relief among the Celtic fan base. Jock, I suppose just as we start to wrap the episode up, I'd ask for any final comments, whether it was on your time at Celtic in general or anything else at all.
No, I'm very happy with the chat we've had, and I just would like to see. I think Celtic is such an important institution in Scotland. It's such an important element in Scotland that the stewardship of it is crucial, because it can have such a beneficial effect on so many lives, and they mustn't lose sight of that because it's really, really important.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect place to round things off. Jock, it's been a genuine pleasure to speak with you today, and a huge thank you to sharing your stories around a crucial time in Celtic history and in your own life. I want to finish by wishing you and your family all the very best, and thanks for joining me today here on the Celtic Exchange.